From Cameroon to Cote d'Ivoire, a gale swept through Africa in the 90s and the 2000s, one that brought a gift with it. Two of Africa's greatest players emerging around the same time, two who would rise to the pinnacle of the sport and break record after record, two of the most dominant strikers that football has ever seen. Never before had the same generation produced two African players who dominated on the world stage like these two. Two whose stories were so intertwined, diverging and converging at will, sparking endless comparisons that have continued beyond retirement. It was never like this until Eto'o and Didier Drogba showed up. The journey was tough and full of rejections, false dawns and challenges that sometimes seemed too great to surmount. But when they arrived, the world had to stand still. Their meetings drew headlines and it was about them, no matter who else was on the pitch. The story could never be complete or good enough without theirs. This is the story of two of Africa's greatest ever players. On the 11th of March 1978, Didier Drogba was born. Almost exactly 3 years later, on the 10th of March 1981, Eto'o arrived too. 1,095 days apart, 3 complete years. The likes of the legendary Laurent Poku and Roger Milla were the revered strikers of the time in their respective countries and in Africa in general. No one really knew what was coming, the greatness that was brewing, which would blow the greatness of these two on a global scale out of the water. Laurent Poku had already become Africa's highest goal scorer, complete with 2 golden boots and a best player award by this point. It was hard to see any Ivorian surpass him in legendary status. Roger Milla, on his part, would go on to win 2 AFCON tournaments with 2 best player awards and 2 golden boots. Things were never straightforward for both footballers in their formative years. Originally born in Yaoundé, Eto'o would grow up in Douala after his father moved the family there seeking a better life. There he honed his skills and showed he could compete with the big boys, already playing at lower division level in his early teenage years. He had big dreams of making it in Europe, hoping to someday reach the pinnacle of the sport while rescuing his family from their harsh daily financial realities. He knew he had a talent that was his family's big hope, and he held on to that conviction, knowing what he was capable of. The teenager started actively trying to get into Europe. After exploring several options, one finally seemed like the way. He secured a trip to France, accompanied by his brothers David and Etienne. It was supposed to be a short trip, visiting, as he got only a 10-day visa, but remained there for months, undocumented, hidden by family. He hoped to attend trials on the low and impress them so much that they would offer him a contract so that he could remain in France and finally chase his dream on a bigger stage. That meant that he was locked in an apartment, unable to go anywhere for fear of being discovered. He only really came out when he wanted to do the trials. And whenever he got a chance to, he would give his best, believing he could impress enough to make something happen. He had to impress. Everything depended on it. But no matter what the young Eto'o did at these trials, he was rejected due to being undocumented. They didn't care what he showed. They did not want anything to do with him. He even had a trial at PSG who refused to sign him as well when they too realized he was undocumented and in France illegally. Eventually, he gave up, saying that there was no team willing to do what he had hoped, and he returned to Cameroon to enroll in an academy. He would try again another time. Not long after, he returned to France again, extra determined to land a deal this time, still convinced that he could. This time, he attended trials at Le Havre, Saint-Étienne, and Caen. Again, it was the same story. All of them rejected him, and he eventually had to accept that France wasn't the path for him. This wasn't the way. It just wasn't happening. Meanwhile, Didier Drogba, who was born in Abidjan in 1978, was already in France. Unlike Eto'o, he had his papers by this point, although he had previously been forced to leave France. Drogba's family had sent him to France when he was 5 years old to live with his uncle, Michel Goba, who was playing for Stade Brestois at the time. The idea was for young Didier to develop under the guidance of his uncle and join a football club. They had noticed his talent and wanted him to get ahead early. Like Eto'o, his talent seemed to be the way for his family to change their destinies forever. The key was for him to earn a professional football contract in the years to come. That was the end game. First though, he had to get into a club so that his permit could be renewed. But young Didier was already a mess right from the plane out of Abidjan. It was a lonely, tear-filled trip for the 5-year-old who could not fathom leaving his family behind to go to a new country and environment, and without them around. That became a factor for the next 3 years. The boy was homesick, as his uncle moved around France, joining 3 clubs in 3 years. Eventually, when he was 8, having not secured anything, he had to return to Abidjan, as his residence permit was not renewed. Nothing had quite worked out. As normalcy returned and the kid was starting to find some stability, issues arose that threw the family into turmoil. His parents lost their jobs. His father had worked as a bank employee and his mother as a typist. The struggles made things unbearable, so Didier had to leave again and return to France a year after leaving. His uncle had resigned for one of his old clubs, USL Dunkirk. This time around, a more mature Didier finally got in. But there was a twist to this tale. He did not come in as a striker. He was brought in to develop as a right back. Samuel Eto'o caught the attention of his country's national team as a 13-year-old, getting called in to play for the cadets team before eventually getting moved up to play for the juniors from when he was 14 years old. It was while playing a game for the juniors, just weeks after the end of his unfortunate adventure in France, that something finally changed in his story. Interestingly, it was a game against Cote d'Ivoire, who were still years away from even noticing Didier Drogba. That day, there was someone significant in the stands watching the game. That someone was Piri, Real Madrid's recruiter, who was so impressed by the young lad that he offered him a trial. Eto'o had scored 2 goals in a 3-2 defeat, and his talent was so obvious that Piri had to act. This was to be the path that would lead Eto'o to the top. Meanwhile, Drogba, whose family had finally joined him in France some years before, had been bouncing around everywhere from Dunkirk to Abbeville with his journeyman uncle, to Toking and Van FC, all within 5 years. In 1993, he began living with his family again in the Parisian suburbs for the first time in 10 years, but he had to repeat a year in school and could not play football for the entire year, a major setback. It was during this time, however, that something changed in Didier. He found focus and renewed vigor to go at his dreams again. When he returned after the year-long hiatus, he joined Levallois SC, where he finally found some stability, staying there for 4 years. This was where he gradually started to show his potential in his preferred role as a striker, steadily developing until he featured in the 4th tier of French football in 1996. Around the same time, Samuel Eto'o returned to Europe to chase his dream, honoring the trial invite with Real Madrid. He arrived alongside another young African, a Nigerian named Anthony Olise, on a freezing winter day, wearing just shorts and a t-shirt. He had no idea what the future held, but it was scary to even think about it. He knew he had to take his chance, as this was the kind of opportunity he had been waiting for. This time he didn't have the obstacle of being without papers. Real Madrid had taken care of things. The other guy with him, Olise, later broke his leg and never made it as a footballer. Eto'o never forgets him till this day and still keeps in touch. The trial was successful and the 15-year-old Samuel Eto'o finally earned a contract with the Spanish Giants, moving to their reserve team Castilla. He was in. All that hard work and dedication had paid off, but there was still so much ahead and he knew it. What he did not know was how hard it was going to be to get the next breakthrough. Castilla's relegation to the tier of Spanish football where non-EU players were not eligible forced him out on loan to Leganés in the Spanish second tier ahead of the 1997-1998 season. But even before that happened, Cameroon's senior national team coach, Claude Leroy, had been following his progress. He opted to call up Eto'o in March 1997 and give him his national team debut at just 16. During this period, Didier Drogba was still far from establishing himself. He was also years away from even catching the attention of his national team, and despite showing promise in the youth team at Levallois, he struggled to make an impact in the first team, which competed in the French 4th division. Injuries had plagued his progress, and even when he managed to play, his performances failed to impress his coach, who just didn't rate him. He soon realized that he wouldn't make it there and sought a new home, but further disappointment soon followed after failing trials with Ron and Guingamp that summer. However, fortune favored him when he matched a specific recruitment need for Le Mans, a second-tier club, who offered to take him in. He accepted the offer, turning down interest from PSG. Le Mans presented an opportunity for a fresh start at a higher level, as well as the chance to pursue university studies in the region, where he opted to study accounting. It was during his time at Le Mans that he began to find his footing, although it took several years. Initially joining as an amateur, he didn't get his first taste of professional football until 1999 at the age of 21, when he signed his first professional contract with the club. But things didn't go well for Drogba. Drogba's struggles with injuries, attributed to his physique and lack of physical conditioning, were evident to his coaches, and it frustrated them. He endured multiple metatarsal, fibular, and ankle fractures, raising concerns about his suitability for the professional game, or even the sport. Described as physically weak and lacking in fitness, he was fortunate that Le Mans showed any patience at all, as most other clubs would have released him. He did not seem worth the trust, and nothing in his performances showed that. Despite the club's faith in him, Drogba failed to fully repay that trust during his time there. His weaknesses were glaring, exacerbated by his lack of proper academic development. It was obvious that he did not have that training and did not have the basics. In 4 professional seasons with Le Mans, he managed to score only 15 goals. Samuel Eto'o's national team career was a sharp contrast from his club career. It did not look like there was a path to consistent first-team football at Real Madrid, and his loan moves barely yielded any fruit. Yet, he was called up to the World Cup in 1998, where he was the youngest player to feature after playing against Italy. At the end of 1999, he was called up to the Cameroon squad for the 2000 Africa Cup of Nations. At this point, Eto'o had not even scored a goal in top-flight club football, despite appearances with Real Madrid and Espanyol. He had also never scored for Cameroon. He had only 4 career goals, scored in the second division for Leganés. As the new millennium began, Y2K as it was called, the inimitable 18-year-old Eto'o was about to make a statement in front of the whole world, on Africa's biggest stage. 21-year-old Drogba, meanwhile, was still a complete unknown, struggling to establish himself majorly off the bench in the French second tier. Cameroon had been drawn with Cote d'Ivoire in their AFCON group, but there was no Drogba. Their rivalry had still not started.